My name is Bubs, I'm an artist, and I like to hear myself talk. And today, I'd like to hear myself talk about exercise. Art exercise, to be specific. Don't worry, I'm not gonna try to get you to join CrossFit today or something. As an artist, I think it's super important to not get too terribly comfortable where I am. Sure, getting confident in a certain process or style is a good thing, but learning requires one to get out of their box, so to speak. To improve, you have to be willing to try new things. Even though I know I have indeed improved as an artist even since starting this channel, I also worry I could be stagnating a bit. There's kind of an internet myth that artists just kind of stop improving when they start to get popular online, and while I know it's not a rule, I also want to make sure I'm not used as evidence for that, because I guess I'm popular now. I swear to all that is good and green in this world, I'm not trying to be annoying when I say stuff like that. I just genuinely cannot comprehend the meaning behind the number next to my name. Like, that's a big number. I don't think the human brain is supposed to deal with this many eyes on them. I digress, as usual. I've been trying to do some more exercises than normal to kind of push me out of my comfort zone, sometimes to target my weaknesses, but sometimes just to help me get out of a rut. And I thought it could be fun to let you guys in on one of those exercises, specifically for the latter option. The thing I'll be showing off today is pretty much what the title is, and aside from being a really easy thing for me to throw together for the channel after the Goliath that was my last upload, it also gives me an opportunity to talk about my process a bit, since that's something some of you have seemed really interested in. So I'm going to hop over to a speed paint while I explain what it is that I'm actually doing here. Oh yeah, baby, that's right. Papa found out how to actually reliably screen record my iPad again, so I can have actual speed paints rather than time lapses. Bet you wish you had this much skill and professionalism and the, $1 or $2 that it cost me to get the app that lets me screencast my iPad display to my laptop, so I could record it all through OBS. My genius is astounding, I am sure. Anyways, the concept behind this little art exercise is just to take all the things that you normally do and try to do whatever the opposite of that is. For example, if you normally put loads of detail into the iris of a character you draw, you would instead draw a super simple iris, or if you normally draw very simple blobby hands, you might try to draw super detailed hands instead. At the end, you should have a piece of art that looks quite different from anything you normally make. While it's definitely a simple idea, it's a fairly significant challenge that makes you think about how your process actually goes while also forcing you to try new things that are out of your comfort zone. The first step for me was to just draw a random person the way that is most comfortable for me to draw a random person. I chose to do this in my more solidly cartoony style since that's what I usually utilize nowadays for pretty much everything I do. It's not the only way I can or do draw, but it is certainly how I usually draw. Plus, I just thought it would be easier to see the comparison. I wanted to draw something that specifically would showcase many of the things that have come to act as hallmarks of my cartooning style, both according to myself and even some of y'all. Things like areas of solid black, simple but still very expressive eyes, the harsh shading on the neck of the character, the distinct blush shapes, the X ears, and even the fully enclosed Muppet noses that are incredibly controversial for some fucking reason. I also took it upon myself to work in a few other quirks of my style, like how I'll typically portray dangly earrings as a stud with a free-floating bit below that, or how I like to shade the top lips of characters with pure black sometimes, similar to how I shade underneath the head. I also made sure to render it completely normally. I used a brush with a ton of line weight variance and a bunch of texture for my line art because I like my brushes versatile and crunchy, and I use the brush that's been my personal favorite for delivering both of those things lately, that being the Inka brush. It actually comes with Procreate, so you can find it, I think, in the inking section, but I did mess around with the settings a teensy bit for myself, so what I'm using here is not default settings. It's not the biggest change though, I just made the tapering a little more intense and adjusted it so the maximum size could be slightly bigger, but other than that, it should function pretty much exactly the same for you. For those of you wondering about the crunchiest of my brushes, or any of the brushes that feature in my comic, those are custom made by me specifically for my comics. As such, I'm really not sure if I'd ever release those publicly. However, I have considered trying to get better at making brushes in general, so I have more than just the Procreate defaults, and if I do that, I definitely release those, even if just to my channel members or something. Sorry if that sounds kind of gatekeepy. It really would be different if I got them from elsewhere, but I made those myself, and I'm allowed to keep them for myself. The other thing of note here is that I use the line color from Girl and Ghost, which isn't actually a straight up black. It's actually a super dark reddish purple sort of color, and I use it for most of my art nowadays. I just prefer it to straight up black for the lines, since it brings a little more color and a little more vibrancy to everything. The only real exception is when I'm lining Mina and co, because I think the pure black actually looks better on those sets of characters, but they are literally very dark in subject matter, so it makes sense to do that for them in my brain. To keep in theme of using my own color palette, I decided to use a skin tone directly from my main comics color palette, since that would be a very normal thing of me to do. I had a few people say the palettes I usually use are very distinct, especially how I use palettes that lean a bit more warm or neutral and rarely have super cool toned work, which is something I definitely do. I just really prefer warmer tone color these days. They just look more lively to me overall. I carry that over into the shading too, once I'm ready for that, using a dark pink from my color palette for all the shading. And yes, I mean dark pink and not red. That I would classify this as dark pink. I think red is its own thing. Anyway, I had a few of you point out that I don't use a whole lot of soft or gradient shading in my art typically, and this isn't the most accurate. I do actually use soft shading very frequently, though the application tends to be pretty subtle and does only really serve as a way to intensify my usual hard cell shading. I just used a multiply layer for all of that since it's my go-to. Though I do typically use a color burn layer for the shading of my comic instead, so little fun fact for you all there. Once I was done with everything, I went in with a couple final details, like adding a couple subtle highlights to the purple part of the character's hair with an add layer, and slapping a waffly screen tone on everything, because I like slapping textures over my pieces at the end. It's the same screen tone you can see on my talk sprites, actually, and once again, I made it myself, and I keep it to myself because I'm rude like that. Next step was, of course, to sketch the same character, but this time trying to do things very differently than I'd normally do. There were a couple of areas that I really thought needed the most focus, that being the eyes, the neck, the ears, and the nose, as those are things that most people seem to say were things that they recognize me for. The tricky part of this is that I couldn't really just do less cartoony, because I do draw less cartoony. Quite often, in fact. The super cartoony stuff is a pretty recent development as far as my entire artist journey goes, probably only about 2 or 3 years old now, and I've been drawing since kindergarten. So I couldn't just go for a default of less cartoony, I also had to keep away from my usual details that I do in my less cartoony stuff too. For the eyes, that mostly meant everything being smaller. Not just the eye itself, but the iris inside of the eyes. I tend to enlarge everything in that general area, as do most artists, I think, but I just think it makes an illustration a lot more expressive. I also went for a shape that's a little outside of what I'd normally do, and really defined the lower lid, which is also something I don't normally do. I wanted the neck to be a little thicker, since I tend to make them thinner than they should be proportion-wise, with the exception of, like, super muscular characters, or maybe characters that are a little on the chunky side. I also wanted to, of course, leave out the solid black shading, because it's also something I've started doing on most, if not all, of my art. For the ears, I wanted them to be less angular, but still not completely rounded, which is something I actually didn't get right away, and had to go back and change once I realized I just drew totally normal ear for me. Drawing an ear without the X inside of it isn't actually all that exciting for me, believe it or not. It's mainly a tool that helps me out when I'm trying to go fast and not end up with muddled details no matter how big the actual illustration is, like when I'm making comics, but even my non-X'd ears end up very angular and with pure black shading towards the inner part of the ear, so I just try not to do that. Finally, for the nose, I really emphasized the nostrils, which I don't normally do, at least not in this particular way, and I didn't add in any of my normal accoutrements, like built-in shading guidelines or little texture marks, and it was painful. This was the first thing that hurt me. Line art was the next thing that hurt me. I decided to use my definitive least favorite brush built into Procreate, the technical pen. This brush is what I'd call a sauceless brush. I apologize if you like it, you're valid for that. I just hate super duper smooth brushes like this. It even has a little blur on the outer edges of the brush to just make it even softer, which, look, if I'm gonna use a brush that isn't crunchy, I at least like the brush to have super hard edges. Your dad likes those too. Ayo! Anyways, seriously, the only joy I get out of line art is how dynamic my favorite brushes are. Like, they feel good to play around with, and I get to add in so many nice texture details, but I couldn't do that this time because of the challenge. Agony. I tried to make the hair more segmented than normal because that feels super different from how I normally go about things. I tend to focus on like very big shapes, so this was definitely a little outside of my comfort zone. I guess the only other thing of note is that I did physically connect the earrings to the character, which is kind of boring, but you know, it's not what I normally do. I decided that I'd go ahead and do shading first for this character, which is definitely a different kind of step in my process. I do it sometimes if I know I'm going to have a lot of soft shadows, because it makes it a lot easier for me to figure out if the shading actually makes sense prior to adding a bunch of colors or patterns and stuff that can really get in the way of those softer, subtler gradients. And of course, I was planning to only use soft shading here as opposed to my normal, pretty much only hard shading. Even the parts that were a bit more firm, I still used an airbrush to achieve that. I also used a blue tone for all of the shadows. I considered using straight up black for the shadows, since that's something I absolutely never do, but I think black shading just completely washes out whatever art you're making, and I wanted to have a chance at liking the end product, and B, I thought using really cool tone shading is a more accurate opposite to my normal warmer tone shading. The colors were pretty straightforward, with the only major difference being that I didn't use anything that was exactly the same color as my line art for the darkest areas, and the lack of blush. I don't only draw the circle blush like this. I actually usually blush using gradients, though I try to build it up with a textured brush because I like the look better. I think it looks more natural. The only way to blush the character in the way opposite to how I normally do it is kinda just not to blush them at all. This, in combination with the general lack of texture, made the character look pretty flat to me at the end, but c'est la vie. Or, as the French would say, c'est la vie. The last thing I did was use some gradient overlays to try and add in some highlights, and then I went ahead and duplicated the line art layer, blurred those lines, and then set them as a low opacity overlay layer to just really make the whole thing seem extra dreamy. That line art business isn't something completely out of my wheelhouse, but it's definitely not something I do unless I'm really going crazy with the lighting. So I get to do one thing that I actually already like the look of, okay? And these are the finished products. Now, obviously I drew both of them, but I do think if the watermark wasn't there, and if you hadn't literally just watched me draw both of them, there's a chance that you might not recognize the second one as something I've made. So, I guess I did accomplish the basic goal of the challenge in creating something that doesn't look like something I'd actually make. I definitely prefer the first one, which is predictable because I draw that way for a reason, but shockingly, I don't hate the second one. I actually really like the nose. I think it turned out pretty cute, and even though I wish the irises were bigger, the way that I shaded and highlighted them turned out really pretty. I even don't totally hate the soft shading on the forehead coming from beneath the hair. That gradient looks a tad ominous, but hey, there are times where that's a really good thing. The blue shading I'm mixed on. I don't really think it looks bad, but I just feel like cool tone shading looks less natural for whatever reason. I feel like the vast majority of real-world lighting and shading is either warm-toned or very neutral-toned, so when I use or see cool-tone shading, it just feels kind of unnatural to me. That could be a personal hang-up or just my personal perception, but I do have that perception, so yeah. I don't know that there are any aspects of this little exercise that really taught me anything that I'll use going forward, to be honest. I'm definitely not gonna start using smooth line art brushes again anytime soon, and you can't make me. That being said, it wasn't a total waste of time or anything. Honestly, I'm kind of proud of myself that I came up with something that, while not the best, also looks somewhat competent despite the imposed obstacles, and it definitely helped me work through a little bit of an art rut that I've been dealing with lately. I really hope you got something out of watching me do this, whether that be inspiration to try this out yourself, hearing me yammer on while you folded some laundry, or just some nice insight into my process, since at the very least, you actually got to see what I was doing when a line showed up for the first time in a while. It is once again time to say thank you to my channel members who you can see scrolling by on screen now. They go above and beyond to support me and this channel, which allows me to invest more time and energy into making cool videos like this one. You can also become a channel member if you have an extra $2 lying around every month. You'll get access to a couple perks, including getting your name on this scroll here, getting access to some behind-the-scenes community tab posts, as well as some cute custom emojis. That's all I've got for now. I know this was way shorter than my usual uploads, like way shorter. For some, a blessing, others a curse, I am sure. I needed to take it easy after last week's video, honestly, and full transparency, whatever my next upload is will probably be similar in scale. I hit kind of a roadblock with the next entry of my Reimagining Ancient OCs series thing, and my other scripts are also giving me a bit of a pain, but I hope that the wait for those things will be worth it. And I really appreciate your patience and your support in the meantime. You guys honestly make the whole taking my time thing a lot less scary, and I thank you for that. I'll let you go now. Until next time, make sure you stay hydrated, do something that makes you happy, and, most importantly, remember that you matter. Bye!
Have you been watching the new episodes of Dan, guys? Because if you have you been liking it so far? I think it's been pretty good so far. I like the spooky ghost guy. Yeah, Evil Eye's pretty cool. Yeah. Mwah.